We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Free Association Radio. This is your host, Robert Phoenix, and I will be with you for the next 60 minutes. And we will cover a lot of ground today, hopefully. And that ground will start with a recap of last night's episode of Mad Men. And you may ask yourself, well, what is it all about? Why is he talking about Mad Men? Well, it's actually, first of all, I think Mad Men is really one of the most important series over the last decade for a number of reasons. But what's really taking place is a very thorough psychological dissection of the modern American male in a very interesting kind of way. I mean, I think that Mad Men is probably, in a lot of ways, right up there with F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway in terms of how these characters, and mostly the male characters, and that's not to say that there isn't a fair amount of complexity with the female characters of the show, because obviously if you watch the show, there are. But it's the men in the show, much like it was the men in The Sopranos, which Matt Weiner, who is the creator of Mad Men, was a part of. It's the men who really fall under the microscope and the scrutiny of the show's writers. And there's layers of what's taking place in Mad Men that ranges from the esoteric and the use of astrology and doubling and Gemini to also the occult. There's a very strong occult factor that's being introduced into the latest series of Mad Men. Now, it has been always kind of slightly on the back burner. There was, I believe it was season 5. It was either 4 or 5, I forget now. It was either season 4 or 5 where Don Draper has his tarot cards read by Anna Draper, who, of course, was the widow of the real Don Draper. And this is just one instance of the occult emerging through Mad Men. There's also another episode, season 6, the current season, where Gleason, who is the departed member of the firm that merged with Sterling Cooper, Draper, Harris, his daughter gives Don an I Ching reading. So there's this thread, this slightly occult and esoteric thread that runs through the show at a very superficial level, but at a deeper level, there's a lot going on. And if you cruise around the internet, you'll find some amazing blogs about Mad Men. And what's taking place now, apparently, is that, well, it's clear that Don Draper, who represents Gemini, two characters, Dick Whitman and Don Draper, he is descending into a ring of hell. He's going through Dante's rings of hell. And the backdrop of what's taking place is the film Rosemary's Baby, which was around, I believe, in 1967 or 68. And this is a very important theme to flesh out, because what we're seeing is a type of Satanism that emerged in the 1970s. A long time ago on my blog, I did a kind of a tongue-in-cheek, sort of snarky blog post about films during the 1970s. It was the rise of satanic cinema. And Rosemary's Baby is the birth of satanic cinema in the 1970s, or the prelude to it in the 1970s, being it was 1968. And so literally the film Rosemary's Baby gives birth to the devil's child, but it also gives birth to the satanic cinema, which would later be followed by The Exorcist, by The Omen, and any number of films, from the cheesy Devil's Reign to there's dozens and dozens of films from the 70s that entertain the notion of Satanism. So the 1970s were a very satanic period, and Mad Men is also sort of beginning to unfold and evolve in this very similar direction. And I noticed it, and it was, I believe, season 4 or 5, and I put a still on Facebook. It was Sally, Dawn's daughter, who created a heart made out of macaroni shells as a school project. And I noticed that she was giving the Baphomet for the heart, which was for her father. So she was basically signaling that her father was the devil. And in the way the season, Megan, who is Dawn's wife, who's an actress, happens to be pregnant. And this is also in alignment with Rosemary's Baby. So there are parallel themes going on at the same time. So Don himself is, it's an interesting name because there's also connotations of Don Juan, as a womanizer, and that's what Don Draper is. There's also the correlation of Don Juan and hell, and so Don is not only the devil or Satan, as it's been pretty much fleshed out by his daughter Sally. Of course, in the last episode, Sally caught him in flagrante with Carol Rosen, the neighbor. Don was comforting her. So now he's really become the devil for her, literally. She won't even talk to him now. So this is an interesting series of events that's taking place with Mad Men. But the bigger picture, and what I wanted to kind of get at, was each male character of the show represents a gradation of the male psyche, and you can put them all together and maybe make one unified whole, perhaps. But they are definitely archetypes. And one of the predominant threads that run through each of their lives is a form of sociopathology. And each character has a certain or particular form of sociopathology, with the exception of maybe Ken. And Ken is fairly wholesome and doesn't really have any closets in the skeleton. However, as a result of that, he has been going through a series of repeated hazings with his clients, or with a client, Chevy, in Detroit. And after every episode, he comes back from Detroit. Something terrible has happened to him. He's gotten into a car wreck. At the beginning of this last episode, he got Dick Cheney. They fired off he was hunting and these guys swung and turned and shot a shotgun and blinded him in one eye, so he's recovering. So that at the beginning of the episode, you think he's dead, but really he shows up and he's got a patch over his eye. So now what do we have? We have the Eye of Horus. Yeah, there's more esoterica for us to chew on. But Ken, because he's probably the most pure out of all the characters, he suffers in some ways the most visceral indignities by these guys from Chevy. All they want to do is degrade him. And it's based on really his character and his nature. But if you look at all the other characters, they're all corrupted. Ken is not corrupted, but they're all corrupted, right? Ken is also, there's also an overtone with like Ken of Barbie and Ken. He's like the Ken doll in some ways. So, but all the rest of them are very corrupted in their own way. And there's a scene where Ken is talking about the humiliation that he has to suffer while he's with Chevy. And Harry Hamlin, who's great, by the way, he's totally great. Harry Hamlin plays this guy, Jim Cutler. And Jim said, he's talking about what they have to do for their clients. And he said, one time one of my clients cupped my wife's breast. And he laughed about it. And then Roger, who's actually one of my favorite characters, he said, yeah, I had the guy who's the son of the Lucky Strike Empire, Lee Garner Jr. He said, I had to cup Lee Garner Jr.'s balls one time. So they're all talking about what they've had to do in order to sell themselves, to literally descend, to get by, to be successful, but also descend. So they're all broken people, and there's nobody in that group that is clean or morally sound, and they're all trying to work it out some way in their own broken way. But what happens is that there is a series of very internecine sociopathological relationships that are taking place between each one of them. And I don't want to get too granular, because if you're not watching the show, you're probably going to get lost. But I will share with you that there's also a dissection very strongly and clearly about men's relationship to women, and misogyny, and what else? Manipulation and entitlement. I mean, there's all kinds of layers that are taking place in the show. And what's happening is that Matthew Weiner is starting to look at a kind of a repressed level of adolescence. In Jungian psychology, they talk about the puer eternus, or the eternal child. And in some ways, that's Don. Don is kind of a puer eternus. And so is Roger, by the way. They're both puers in their own way. But he's also looking at repressed homosexuality and how men interact with one another in a professional environment that is fairly predatory, and that have to lean on each other emotionally, but at the same time will find vulnerabilities in one another and take advantage of them, because that's part of the job, part of the nature, and also part of the fact that in a weird, strange way, this is how they bond. They're incapable of real love, and so what they are capable of is kind of an anti-love, which is running throughout the show. Now, what's also interesting is there's a new character. His name is Bob Benson. So you get the BB, Bob Benson, like Don Draper, DD. So you have B and D, which is also bondage and discipline, right? B and D, bondage and discipline. All right. And so now there's a whole other series of, mirroring that's taking place in Mad Men. And Bob Benson is also a character with a very different past, just like Don Draper. In fact, he's kind of cut from the same cloth in his own way. So now there's two sort of Don Draperish characters operating in the Mad Men multiverse. And Bob Benson is interesting in that he is probably the nicest person inside the office. He's always listening to self-help records. which is kind of funny. But he's also he has common sense advice. When Ginsburg was melting down, he was able to help him out. So, but at the same time, he has a completely separate identity. He has a dark past, and he is working out his own self-interest by helping other people, which is an interesting notion if you think about it. So now you have these two forces of duality and duplicity that are swirling around and getting ready to collide here at the end of Mad Men, at the season's end of Mad Men. And one of the undercurrents of the Bob Benson character is that there's a chance that he might be gay, although it's not quite really fleshed out yet as to what his real sexual orientation is. But it's becoming clearer that it's certainly not your run-of-the-mill heterosexuality that Ken practices with his wife and soon-to-be child, or even the same kind of predatory sexuality or heterosexuality that Don practices when he steps out of his marriages and has numerous affairs. So this is going to be a very interesting ending to Mad Men. By the way, what's really fascinating too is Don's descent into hell starts when he's made to sign a contract, and right after he signs a contract, he has an interaction with the English partner Lane Price, and Lane Price had taken some money out of the company in order to pay his tax bill with England, and he didn't tell anybody. This was kind of an English thing, right? He couldn't ask for money because it wouldn't look right. It wouldn't be proper. It wouldn't be having that stiff upper lip. He didn't want to also feel like he would be vulnerable and taken advantage of, because he knows that he's in a jungle with predators. And so instead, what he does is he becomes Serpentine, and he takes money out of the general fund, the GAO, whatever it's called, and forges a check and uses Don's name for $5,000. And so Don has to fire him. And then as a result of Don firing him, he winds up committing suicide. And this is all, again, right after Don signs his first contract with the firm. And that contract is a 3-year contract, which means that likely when his contract is up, the show might be up as well. So we'll have to watch that. But this is interesting. And now Don's soul is owned by the corporation, by the third-party entity. And the first thing that happens, the initiation into that contractual agreement, is Lane Price committing suicide. And he had hanged himself just like Don's brother Adam did very early on. I believe it was season 1. And he found Don. He was surprised to see Don, and Don wanted nothing to do with him. So Adam hanged himself. And he actually is the ritual sacrifice for the creation of Don Draper. And that moment, Dick Whitman dies and Don Draper is truly born, because the last living legacy of his past, his brother, half-brother, has passed away. And Don is the one that literally pushes him towards that death. And the same thing happens with Lane Price as well. So what fascinates me about Mad Men and the opera, I mean, this is Wagnerian opera, really. Rings of Hell, it's all Gotterdammerung stuff, right? In a lot of ways. And so what fascinates me about Mad Men is how it relates to the world that we're living in. Because I do think that Matthew Weiner has some real insight into the psychodynamics of these men. And even though they are operating in a particular milieu, which starts from 1958 up through the 60s and the rise of advertising in this country, even though they're in that milieu, the predominant themes are still at play in our society at large. And let me give you an example. Yesterday, I was watching, very briefly, and I don't do this often, but I was watching one of the Sunday morning news shows, and Dick Cheney was on. Now, we haven't seen Dick Cheney in quite some time, but he's making the rounds now. And one of the things that was asked of Dick Cheney was, did he agree with how the current administration handled Benghazi? And Dick Cheney said no. He said no. And what was being communicated or asked of him and then communicated by him was that what the current administration should have done was engage as quickly as possible with the Benghazi crisis. And he was polite, but he wasted no time in throwing Leon Panetta under the bus. And this is exactly the kind of behavior that is fleshed out and exemplified or brought to light on Mad Men. Now, did Leon Panetta deserve to be thrown under the bus? Probably. Or maybe Cheney said, I'd rather not comment on that right now. That's something that the current administration is working on. But he didn't do that. He went right for the jugular, and he said, yeah, they knew that this could happen. And yeah, there was a base an hour away. They could have sent planes in. They could have responded. And I thought it was really fascinating because if you really go down into the core of 9/11 and you try to understand what was taking place at the time, everything was going to hell. Norman Mineta, who used to be the mayor of the town that I grew up in, San Jose, California, he was the mayor when I was a kid. Mineta, they named San Jose Airport after, by the way, was underground at that time. They were under the White House. And Mineta, and you can go into the internet and you can find this, Mineta heard Dick Cheney tell people to stand down. There were flights, there were planes that they could have released and sent into the skies to take these planes out that theoretically hit the Pentagon, theoretically, and the Twin Towers. But Cheney, and this is again an exact quote from Norman Mineta, told them to stand down. And the guy on the other end who was asking him asked for clarity. And so Cheney told him to stand down twice. So here we have a situation where he is essentially outing the Obama administration for not responding to Benghazi in really what looks to be a stand-down situation, where in his own world, during 9/11, he did exactly the same thing. He stood down and let the event happen because there's, in a lot of ways, there's a lot more political capital that can accrue and result out of something gone bad or some type of chaos which is artificially inflicted onto a situation. And so what happened? Well, we have the Patriot Act and all these other wonderful things that have come out of 9/11. And I think that while the current administration was not that invested in the outcome, or as invested in the outcome of what happened in Benghazi as the Bush administration was with 9/11, clearly they were willing to take advantage of that for some type of political capital, whatever it was, right? So what I'm getting at here is that this type of behavior is rampant, okay? It is rampant at the highest levels, in the highest circles, and it trickles down. It's the same kind of behavior on Mad Men, which is taking place in the quote-unquote real world. And these are the people that are pushing the buttons, making the decisions, and generally directing the flow of resources and commerce around the planet. And it's in some ways frightening to think about that. especially when it's within the context of a show like Mad Men. Now, are there the Kens of the world, who are playing at a high level? Probably. Maybe David Petraeus was one of them. Everything David Petraeus did was exemplary. He was always at or near the top of his class. The types of moral values or morals and values that he espoused and was invested in were almost like Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius. I'm sure that he probably quoted them quite a bit, through his work. There was something very Grecian, like a Pax Romana about David Petraeus, and yet he was vulnerable. He had his frailties, and he got caught. He got caught with his pants down, and as a result, he had to resign from the largest intelligence gathering agency in the world, apparently outside of the NSA. We'll get into the NSA in a little bit. So I guess what I'm saying is that even at a high level where there are exemplary people, they've got skeletons in their closet, or they are just as open to falling prey to their vices as the not-so-virtuous peers that they interact with. So this is where we are. We're in a world right now, and things are heating up very intensely. There are more revelations coming out of the Snowden camp. Edward Snowden, also known as Eric Snowden. If you didn't know that, by the way, he also goes by Eric. So there's two versions of Mr. Snowden. And this week there are going to be more documents that will be released to Glenn Greenwald. And that is going to be very interesting to see how that all unfolds. What I find fascinating is that liberals have adopted Ed Snowden. Very strange. When I say liberals, I mean people like Michael Moore. Michael Moore has adopted Ed Snowden. Michael Moore is a dyed-in-the-wool liberal. So he's like, yeah, Ed Snowden, that guy is a hero. Julian Assange, I believe, is fairly liberal. Decided that Ed Snowden's a real deal. He's a hero. There's a website called avaz.org, which is deeply invested in liberal causes. They're supporting Ed Snowden. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes before Al Gore comes out and backs Ed Snowden. So I don't know what that means, but I find it interesting because these are people who normally keep their noses clean when it comes to this type of dissension with the current administration. Now, for the first time in months, Obama's popularity rating has fallen by 8%. Now, that's an official number. I think that the unofficial number is probably triple that, because I cruise on Facebook and I'll find any number of people that have supported him who are quote-unquote liberals or progressive, and he's lost them. He's totally lost them. Even the ones who have held out and said, well, this is all Bush is doing, or he can only do so much, or he's got a bigger plan in play, they're losing patience with him. And those types of excuses just aren't playing as well as they used to. So I think it's probably more triple than 8%, but let's just say 8% is the number. 8% is actually fairly significant. If you look at it, it takes him, I believe, below 50% for the first time over the course of his administration. Now, Bush was around 46, 47% the entire time he was president, so it doesn't mean you have to be popular in order to be president. However, when the popularity rating begins to fall, there are other things that go along with it. For instance, when you look at the homepage for Yahoo, where Yahoo clearly says that his popularity rating has gone down 8%, there's a very interesting picture of Obama, and he looks inept. It's the first time there are pictures, you could cruise around the internet, you can find photos of him where he does not look like he's really a leader. However, this is the first time I've seen it on Yahoo where they're showing a side of him that is definitely not leader worthy or leadership worthy. He looks like he is kind of an inept bumbler. And what's happening is that there is now a picture that's being painted of Barack Obama as being less than powerful, less than stellar in his own position. Now, Obama being a Leo, and I do think he's a Leo, although he doesn't have the hair for being a Leo. When he was young, he had the hair, but he doesn't really have the hair for being a Leo. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that no matter where he was born, if he was born, that he is a Leo. That's the birth certificate or whatever it's called, the description of birth, the classification of birth, whatever they call that. But let's just say he's a Leo. One of the things that Leos have a really difficult time with is pride. Pride and vanity and arrogance. And if he is being disrespected or made foolish of, and let's just say for the sake of argument that he's not an actor as we have become known or we're becoming trained to understand as an actor, that he's not an actor, that he's actually a person who is part of a much larger plan and a much larger directive. Let's say he is that person. He's not faring well right now in terms of how he's being portrayed, which means that he's vulnerable. And what happens when people are vulnerable, especially presidents, every president has their own shadow side. And let's face it, they have a ton of power when the powers that be vest them with carrying out their directives. Then they have a lot of power. If the powers that be don't invest them with carrying out their directives, then they can be very powerless, which we saw with Jimmy Carter. But they do have, each president has their own shadow and their own Chiron, for lack of a better term. And when we look at somebody like Bill Clinton, who is also a Leo, the parallels between Bill Clinton and Barack Obama are quite interesting, actually. Both in terms of their birth, but also their unusual upbringing. Like Clinton was raised by his uncle, and some other people as well, some very well-connected political people. But they have a very similar sort of almost Runyon-esque rags to riches American story. It's what it's supposed to be, or what it's supposed to look like. But of course, Clinton's vulnerability to some extent was his vanity, but it was a different type of vanity that Barack Obama has. Clinton's vanity was associated with women, and that if he could have women, then he would be powerful, and just like his idol John F. Kennedy. But that was his vulnerability. That was his shadow. That was his Chiron. For Barack Obama, it doesn't really have to do with women, because we never have any. When Clinton was in office, oh my God, I mean, the scandals were coming at him right and left. It doesn't really happen with Obama. Obama's connections might be actually more madman-esque, to be honest with you. He's got a group of guys, from Hawaii. They get away. They play golf together. He goes down to Florida. He hangs out with Michael Jordan, Ahmad Rashad, this guy that owns the Houston Astros. It's all done with men. Men. Reggie Love, the body man, he's there a lot. So Obama's network of relationships, especially intimate ones, tends to fall more in the camp of men, which has led to a great deal of speculation about his sexual preference. Now, that really, again, doesn't really matter what he does with, his private time. Well, yes and no. As a individual, as a private citizen, absolutely not. As a president, there could be this is an area where it gets tricky, because even though we are living at a time where gay rights, gay culture are, not just justified but celebrated, he still, as an American president, cannot come out and say, yeah, I really love men. In fact, I love men in ways, that separate me from other men at times. He can't say that, because even though the public might say, oh, we don't care, we love you, you're our president, you do whatever you want, as long as, you don't do anything crazy to our country, they can't say that, and they won't say that, and that would not be the predominant judgment that would be charged against Barack Obama. By the way, it has nothing to do with what he does, but it has everything to do with how he's framed himself, how he's portrayed himself to the American public, because that would be a bigger betrayal. It would be a much bigger betrayal than coming out and saying, yeah, I like men, I like the company of men. No, the bigger betrayal would be the lying to the American public, and that's where the vanity comes in. And so what we have here is potentially a very similar case to Woodrow Wilson, or a very similar case to J. Edgar Hoover, both of whom were blackmailed. Bill Clinton was blackmailed. He was blackmailed by the Lewinsky affair. And once he was on the ropes and looked like he was going to be impeached, he basically did everything that was asked of him by the military-industrial complex. He started a no-fly zone over Iraq, which was deadly. They were dropping DU over Iraq with this no-fly zone. And there was a major embargo of goods with Iraq. So it all started on Bill Clinton's watch. A lot of people think, oh, this is a George Bush creation. No, it wasn't. It was George Bush 1 creation. Bill Clinton, who was aided and abetted by George Bush 1 to get into office, he eventually carried on with the Bush mandate, or the international mandate. However, he didn't do it until his hand was forced. And the forcing of his hand was impeachment. He also, once he assented to essentially cutting off Iraq from the rest of the world, there was also the business of dealing with the Balkanized states and supporting NATO and going in and essentially cutting and slashing these new territories, which had just opened up after the fall of the Iron Curtain, or the Berlin Wall. And so American companies could go in and start to really get their toeholds on these resources in this region that the Russians had never tapped into, for reasons based on technology and other things as well. So he was more than willing and able to be a part of the NATO assaults on the Balkanized states. So he was compromised. Now, we're dealing with a president at this point in time who appears to be compromised as well, and that compromise has to do with the scandals that are swirling around him. To some extent are going away, but others are sticking around, the latest being, of course, the NSA scandal. Now, once they have somebody on the run and they're compromised, they'll do anything. They'll do anything that they ask, because they have found the one thing that will shame them publicly. And everybody has it personally, from an individual level to people that are in public service. And there's some people who are clean and virtuous, but I don't think there's a lot of that. So what's happening now is you're seeing a lot of activity coming out of the Obama administration having to do with Syria, because this Syria is going to be Obama's Balkans, but it's going to be much worse. And in fact, Syria could be Obama's Vietnam. This has the potential of really spiraling out of control. There are at least 300 troops on the Lebanese-Syria border, and the United States is committed to sell and arm the quote-unquote rebels. Now, I'm not going to get into the granularity of it, but you can go on the internet and you can find stories of these rebels who are going in and wholesale slaughtering villages, many of which are Christian, by the way. And it's pretty awful. And Syria is in a fight for its life. And Assad is he's an oligarchic ruler. He's not perfect. But he's in a fight for his life now for the sovereignty of his own country and his own people, because what they don't want is they don't want to install a Muslim Brotherhood type government in Syria, and that's really what would take place once Assad falls. So there are troops on the Lebanese border with Syria, and there has been an agreement to arm these quote-unquote rebels. So Russia has said, hey, if you're going to throw down there, we're going to push back. And, oh, by the way, Barack Obama has already said that there will be a no-fly zone over that area as well. Iran has committed troops to Syria. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing the chess pieces all come together for World War III. And the reason why this is taking place is because somebody at a very high position is being compromised and is going along with this, and going along with it for the detriment of the rest of us. Now, we have the ongoing riots in Turkey, which are incredibly interesting, and I'm convinced that the Turkey riots have nothing to do with anything that came out of Optor or any of the springs. Now, Optor, or a version of Optor, which I've seen some banners called Optic, might have jumped in on this, but this is very different. And these people are pushing back pretty hard on a guy who is really laying down all of his cards and showing everyone he's a dictator. I'm talking about Erdogan. And what's happened in Turkey is interesting because they have achieved a level of prosperity over the course of the last 10 years. They've really grown their economy, and they're one of the strongest economic forces in that kind of pan-European area, and even with Europe. Turkey has a very robust economy. Now, what happens is that once economies are very robust, the people that control the economies or the scale of economies on a global basis don't want those economies to rise too high, because if they rise too high, then what happens is that there is less money for them, for the quote unquote, the elite, the uber elite, or the 0.5%. And it may seem ridiculous. That maybe there could be a 5 to 6% rise in the standard of living or income with the middle class in a place like Turkey, or the lower middle class, and it not being a big deal. But the fact of the matter is that it is a big deal for the people that are scooping up the money, because they don't want anybody getting a toehold and getting more resources and having the ability to be sovereign in their own family life and their own world, however that gets played out in their particular region. Plus, it's also like poker. If you play tournament poker, and I've used this analogy before, your goal is to get the chips from everybody on the table. The only person that's supposed to have chips at the end is you. That's it, you. So this is also in alignment with this whole concept of even a 5 to 6% increase in the cost of living is unacceptable. So what they've done is they raised the standard of living in Turkey, and now Erdogan wants to shut it down. And how he wants to shut it down, or how he proposes shutting it down, is by bringing in Islam and making Islam and the religious laws of Islam more integrated into the overall structure of Turkey. And so he's actually creating a very conservative atmosphere. And the people there have now had about 10 years of free economic commerce and progress and thought that goes along with it. And they don't want Erdogan to bring in this simulacra of a system, Islam, so that they could use Sharia law and hold the economy back, push the economy back, and have it so that it's not just the economy, but also freedom of thought, freedom of expression becomes a much more kind of medieval in some ways philosophy for the entirety of the people. So this is what they're also very concerned about. And quite frankly, I don't blame them. And it's been a very organic pushback. But a lot's happening there. They're putting chemical agents in the water cannons, and people are getting, fairly hurt. And it's some of it's disturbing that they would turn on their own people like that. So it started off with a park and trying to keep a park intact. I don't know where it's going now. I don't know what the millennials want out of this, whether they want Erdogan to step down. And if he does step down, then who's going to replace him? Have they even thought that through? I don't know if they have, which is kind of dangerous. But this is what's taking place. I know the good news is that it could be interfering with the all-out war effort on Syria right now. Although I don't think ultimately that it will, but it makes it more challenging than it was before this major conflagration came up in Turkey, because Turkey is right across from Syria and is a major strategic jumping off point for any kind of conflict there. So if the Russians came through with one of their ships, they'd have to either go around Turkey or pass through it, depending on where it was coming from. And as a result, there could be a very strong police presence in that region from the Turks. But if they are internally conflicted and there's strife, then there's a chance that they may not necessarily have everything that they need or all the people that they need, or be on the same page in terms of a strike or an attack plan. So it's a major distraction what's going on for them with the riots. So the longer the riots stay in place, in some ways it's better for what's happening in Syria. Will it ultimately stem the tide and keep Syria from exploding like an M80, like 1,000, a million M80s? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. But from where I'm sitting, we are getting closer and closer to World War III. And it has to do with mad men who have not gotten into their psyches and really tried to integrate kind of who they are. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because sociopathology and even worse, psychopathology is a virus. And once you become infected with it through the behavior modification of other people, it's very hard to stop it. Now, there's a strain of sociopathology which is related to being asocial, which is a kind of a different breed unto itself. And there are people, and I actually think Obama might fall into this camp. I think Obama is self-interested, but at the same time, at least at the beginning, he demonstrated a desire to help and to come to the rescue of the American people and to promise a better way, a more sane way, a more holistic way, a more transparent way. And I think that that's part of his DNA, but at the same time, he has a very kind of self-interested aspect to what he's doing. So he wants to help, but he also is very invested in kind of who he is. And I don't think that this is uncommon. And I think it's where sometimes people get their things wrapped around their axle. And I'm not taking Obama off the hook, but I am sharing with you that there is a certain type that can be both clinically described in terms of their condition, but at the same time kind of evolve alongside of it as almost like a strategy to deal with what we would call the original sin, to be able to help people or to be able to be of some form of service. And these two realities can actually run parallel. Now, Bob Benson in Mad Men actually displays this. He displays his self-interest sociopathology, and at the same time, he's the most open, to a certain extent, and caring person, to a certain extent, inside that office. So two conditions are not mutually exclusive. This is what the show's creators are getting at, and perhaps Obama might fall into that same camp. I don't think so, not at this point. But any type of him being able to assert his own will in his presidency, I think, has come to an end. And what we're about to see now is the aggregation of all of these forces that are aligning to make massive changes on this planet. And we're in it right now. This is a very big time. This is a huge time. And I feel like we are going to see something very dramatic over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks. We might even see it this week with the solstice, right around the 21st or the 22nd. And I've stated this before because we have the Grand Water Trine coming in. And the Grand Water Trine has the potential to cleanse, in a lot of ways, cleanse our sins. And getting in one good final desecrating shot before this happens might be the strategy and what's on the table right now. So I think the next couple of weeks are going to be very powerful and important to witness and observe. Things are coming to a head. Syria is coming to a head. It is not going to go away. Assad is not going to sit down and have Turkish coffee with the NATO forces and the head of the UN. He's seen what's happened to all these other guys in that region. He's not going to do it. So there's not going to be any kind of peace talk or diplomacy or some kind of plan to transition him out of there. He cares about his people, whether or not you think he does, he does. And what he sees going on right now, what he sees is taking place in Libya and Egypt, he cannot be encouraged at all to hand over the well-being of these people to a group who don't represent them. All they represent is the interests of the New World Order, for lack of a better term. So it's not going to go away. It will come to a head. Now, running parallel to that, we have the NSA piece, and I don't know. I'm still on the fence with Edward Snowden. One would think that if he was really that important to get, that they could get him. It wouldn't be that hard. I read a piece last night by Dave Lindorf, and Dave Lindorf was commenting about Naomi Wolf, and Naomi Wolf was making a case for Ed Snowden as being part of the NSA. And she made a really clear case. I mean, she was very cogent about what she was saying. And, why would Ed Snowden be allowed to do this? Why is it being picked up? I mean, there's all these little check boxes. At the end of her piece, she says, well, there's a chance that he might actually work for the NSA. And this is all part of a kind of a controlled opposition sort of piece, a PSYOP, another PSYOP. And Dave Lindorf then accuses Naomi Wolf as working for the NSA. So we're in really crazy times, and it's mirrors. We're in a hall of mirrors. And the next few weeks are going to be, I think we're going to be living through history in the next few weeks. So hang on to your hats, boys and girls. I think it's going to get very intense. And that's not even to mention what's happening with the weather and the fires in Colorado and what might be taking place here in the middle part of the country, in the East Coast, with the rise of waters and potential flooding as well. So I don't want to be a doomsayer. That's not what this is about. But today I'm just trying to connect the dots between the type of behavior and psychopathology that's displayed on Mad Men and how it relates to these people that are running the world, who really are, for all intents and purposes, mostly Mad Men. And if there's redemption for Don Draper, perhaps there might be redemption for some of them. We don't know. The final episode of Mad Men is next week. And it feels to me like Don Draper must occupy the ninth ring of hell before he could be redeemed by, of course, Beatrice. And so perhaps reality will follow along or follow suit with Mad Men. Okay, that's it for today. I'll be back on Wednesday with Navigating the Astrological Matrix, 2 hours of astrology and tripping around the stars. We'll look at the supermoon, and we'll look at also the upcoming solstice, which should be very powerful for a lot of reasons. Edward Snowden's birthday, for one. So you know the drill. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to say what's possible. This is Robert Phoenix. You've been listening to the Monday Mashup, and do your best to love your inner sociopath. They need love too. I'll see you on Wednesday.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.